Well, good evening, I guess, to you, or good afternoon. It's morning for me. I just finished breakfast, and good to be with you today. And you are interested in Revelation chapter 9, and I'm interested in that too, because as I was looking for a doctoral topic, you look for something that people haven't done too much with. And so I chose Revelation 8 and 9, the trumpets. And within that, the most difficult part, as you've discovered, is Revelation 9. So we will work together on this text, but also do some background. And let me share my screen with you so that, let's see. All right, I need to get there. All right, can you see that, Nemanja?
Yes.
Okay, good. So we are ready to go then. All right, so the fifth and sixth trumpets is what you asked me to do. But before we do that, I'd like to give some larger background. And that is that the seven trumpets of Revelation are an extremely challenging text. I chose it for my doctoral dissertation because hardly anyone had said anything significant about the topic through the years. So there's also no official Seventh-day Adventist position. So if anybody tells you there's an official Seventh-day Adventist position, you can just tell them that that is not the case. And how would I know that? Because I was a member of DARCOM, the Daniel and Revelation Committee that the General Conference set up in 1981 until 1992, or 1991 perhaps, about 10 years. And it was the best Daniel and Revelation scholars in the church. I was the youngest person on that committee, which means that I'm the only one left that isn't retired or no longer with us. But I can tell you that we worked very hard on the trumpets, and we had some general agreements, but in the details, it proved very, very difficult. So there's no Seventh-day Adventist, no official position. So you're free to study and to make up your own mind. But I would encourage you not to make it a solid foundation for doctrine. In other words, this is not the part of the Bible where the core of our faith is dependent on it. So people who study the trumpets, develop convictions, and then try to change the world with it, it's probably not a helpful process. I think God has given us texts like this because it encourages us to study. When we don't know what is in the text, it makes us curious, and we keep coming back. And to study the Bible deeply is of course, spiritual food for us. So when you're dealing with the trumpets, you need to be very careful and attentive to what kind of method you will use. And if we had, time to go through all the method, that would be an important starting place. But let me say something about scholarship, because people may call me a scholar. But what is a scholar? It's not someone who knows many things. A true scholar is someone who knows how little he or she knows. That scholarship is not about knowing many things. A lot of people know many things, but scholars are people who know when they don't know, who know the limits of their knowledge. And a true scholar will not wow you with many ideas, but rather be very, very careful and not say more than what the text actually calls for. As we begin, I need to also point out that human beings are naturally self-deceived. Jeremiah says, the heart is deceitful above everything else and desperately wicked. Who can know it? In other words, our hearts deceive us. It's when we're most certain that we are absolutely right when we may be most deceived. In other words, the more confident we are sometimes, the more we are subject to that self-deception. And the remedy for self-deception is careful exegesis. And the word exegesis, it's a Greek-based word that simply means to draw out from the text, to read in the text what is actually there. The opposite of that is to read into the text what we want to see in the text. And that is very easy to do. My cousin married a Pentecostal minister, and I like to say that she made an Adventist out of him and he made a Christian out of her. It was a good deal. But the Pentecostal ministers don't often have much training. They're excitable preachers, but they don't have much Bible knowledge. And so he had never heard the word exegesis. And he asked me, what is that? And I said this, I said, it's the art of learning how to read the Bible in such a way as to leave open the possibility you might learn something. In other words, most people approaching the Bible don't learn anything because they approach the Bible to support what they believe rather than to learn the Word of God, to learn what God would want them to know. And so exegesis is all about learning what the Bible has to teach us rather than necessarily supporting what we already believe. Or as one of my professors used to say, it isn't hard to have strong convictions on any subject as long as you're willing to ignore some of the evidence. The problem with the trumpets is the more you know, the less certain you may be that you really understand them. They are truly challenging to understand. So if you want to go deep, I encourage you to take a look at this book, The Deep Things of God. And there I lay out the method by which I study the trumpets. And it's very important to have the correct method so that the results will be reliable. I would not be surprised if this book is available in Serbo-Croatian language. A number of my key books have been translated, and you could check with the Adventist publishing houses in Serbia or Croatia and see if that book is available. If not, perhaps Nemanja and I can find a way to get an electronic copy to you.
Yes.
Okay. So anyway, I'd like to share with you, and we'll get into the text very shortly, but I think it's very important that we cover some basics. It's what I call a life hermeneutic, and this is chapter 4 in the book that I just mentioned. And I'll give it to you very briefly, that when you're studying the Bible, it's important, of course, to study it with prayer and self-distrust. In other words, to truly have an open mind when you open the Bible, to see things maybe you have not seen. If you don't know the original languages, which are the best way to approach it, if you don't know them, then it's helpful, if you can, to have multiple translations. And those of you that can read the English, you can have your own language Bible and some English Bibles to compare with. And there are programs that you can get, like Bible Works, and I think Logos is another one. There are various Bible programs you can get that have many languages and many versions of the Bible. So using a variety of translations is wise, because translators sometimes put their own bias into the text. And by looking at multiple translations, you can get a better sense of how clear the original is. I would suggest you prioritize the clear texts in the Bible. The trumpets are not a clear text. So it is absolutely fine to be studying the trumpets as part of the Bible. But if that's the only thing that you're studying, there's a danger that you might end up in some strange destinations. And I've seen people studying the trumpets ending in some very strange places. So spend more time on the clear texts of the Bible than the unclear texts. And how would you know what is a clear text? It's when all the translations say the same thing. When the translations are all pretty much identical, you know that's a clear text. It's an easy text to translate. But when your translations have many different things coming up, when they disagree with each other, then you know you have a difficult text. The trumpets are such a difficult text. And then spend more time reading the Bible than studying it. And why would I suggest this? Because when you study the Bible, you are in control. You're the one that decides what you're going to study, how you're going to go about it, what is important, what is not. When you read the Bible, the author is in control. It's the author that put chapter 1 in front of chapter 2, in front of chapter 3. When you use a concordance, you choose the texts that seem important to you, and it gives you more control. So I would suggest that while studying is good, using a concordance is good, spend more time reading the Bible and seeing the big picture. And then listen to others, which is what you're doing as a group. Listen to others that are studying the text just as hard as you are. And what can be especially helpful is if the person you're studying with disagrees with you. I'm part of a study group in Southern California that is mostly Seventh-day Adventists, but we have 2 Roman Catholics in the group. And we have a couple of evangelical Protestants in the group. And their perspectives are just so fascinating. And they're an important part of our study team, because when someone disagrees with you, they may see things in the text that you would miss. That happened to me once. I was studying the trumpets in a group where I was the only Seventh-day Adventist. And one of them was a Roman Catholic scholar, someone I knew very well. And she said, the text says this. And I said, no, it doesn't. And she said, yes, it does. And I said, no, it doesn't. And we were having a disagreement on what the text says. And then she said, read the text. And I had my Greek Bible in front of me. And I looked at the text. And it was exactly what she said. You see, I must have had a Seventh-day Adventist bias in reading that text, because I never saw what she saw. But coming from a Roman Catholic perspective, she saw something in that text that I had missed. And there was another occasion where we had it in reverse, and I saw something in the text that she had never seen. So don't be afraid to talk about the Bible with people you disagree with, because they may well point you to things that you have missed. And that will be an important part of it. So part of this life hermeneutic is to listen to people that don't see things the way you are. And they may be able to point you to things you would otherwise miss. And then finally, for Seventh-day Adventists who use the writings of Ellen White, to use them appropriately. I think there's a tendency of Seventh-day Adventists that every time Ellen White gives the least hint of a biblical text in her writings, the assumption is that what she is saying at that point is the best interpretation of that text. And the reality is, Ellen White rarely quotes the biblical text for exegetical purposes. She rarely quotes the text to say, well, this is what Paul was trying to say to the Corinthian church. She quotes the Bible or alludes to the Bible for her own purposes, just as preachers do. And therefore, to take every comment of Ellen White as a final word on what the Bible text means might be an improper use. And so I've developed a method for looking at Ellen White, and this was published by the General Conference in 1992 as part of their series on the books of Daniel and Revelation. And I said, first of all, is Ellen White even quoting the biblical text? Sometimes she's not referring to it, but just uses the language. And I can give you an example of where she made use of one of Paul's sayings in the opposite of what Paul was using that same saying for. But it clicked in her mind. She had read it in their Bible in the past, and that phrase clicked in her mind, and she used it in another context, but not in the way that Paul was using it. So first of all, let's make sure she's actually quoting the text. And second, is she using it exegetically? Is she actually trying to tell us this is what that text means? This is what the writer was trying to say. She rarely does that. And when she does that, it's usually when she is quoting from other authors that are doing that. God's mission to Ellen White was not exegesis of the Bible, but to guide us to a passion for God and a passion for his word. And she did that extremely well. Is Ellen White quote in a published book where she was very carefully working things over? Or was it a private letter? Was it a compilation where someone else is putting text together in a way that she never did? So whether or not it's a published work is important to consider as you weigh Ellen White's statement. When she uses a Bible text, is that text central to what she's trying to do, to what she's trying to say? Or is it simply something she mentions in passing? Very important. Is it earlier in her life or later in her life? Many times she said things earlier in her life that she corrected later on. She says, no, that, people have understood me to be saying that, but that's not really what I meant. And you allow a prophet to correct the misunderstandings of what they have written before. And finally, is her use of that text frequent? Does she use that text a lot, and does she have a consistent way of using it? Or is it just one time in all of her writings, she happens to mention that text? So you don't have a lot of background. Anyway, these are some foundational ideas that I think are important if you're going to tackle an extremely difficult text. We wouldn't dream of using anything but exegesis on the clear text of the Bible. When the Bible texts are clear, we don't try to find some symbolic meaning for them. We don't try to find some connection with history or something else. So why should we abandon sound method when we come to the more difficult text? And I've noticed that people will often abandon sound methods when they come to the trumpets, but they will be very, very careful in the clearer texts. So I'm saying let's be as careful in the trumpets as we would be anywhere else. A consistent methodology. And as I mentioned before, my book, Deep Things of God, gives a careful and comprehensive approach to how one would study the book of Revelation. All right. One last thing, and then we'll get into the text itself. Can we learn something about the trumpets from fulfilled prophecies in the Bible? In other words, where in the Bible you have a prophecy, and then the Bible gives the fulfillment of the prophecy. Can we learn how God thinks? Can we learn how God moves from prophecy to fulfillment, from prediction to fulfillment? That is the question. And in chapter 2 of Deep Things of God, I gave that analysis in which I looked at many, many fulfilled prophecies in the Bible and drew out principles for how you look at unfulfilled prophecy. With the trumpets, much of it is either unfulfilled or we don't know what it means. Can we read the trumpets in a way that gets us closer to God's intention, would be the question. So in chapter 2 of the Deep Things of God, is an outline of how fulfilled prophecy should impact the way that we study the book of Revelation in general and the trumpets in particular. One very popular view, and Uriah Smith seems to have held that view, is that prophecies are movies of the future. In other words, the prophet in vision was seeing actual future events, not understanding them, so describing them as best he could. And so with Uriah Smith, when he saw the images of the trumpets, he was thinking of battles in the Middle Ages and things like that, that John was seeing these actual events, but giving a poor description simply because he didn't understand what those events were. In my study of fulfilled prophecy, never does God use that method. In other words, if that was God's purpose in the trumpets, it's the only time God ever did it that way. And there's no hint that God is doing things differently in the trumpets. If you read the trumpets as movies of the future, you are not likely to be understanding them. If you read the trumpets as if they were given in 1995 instead of 95, you will read them differently. I've seen many people reading the trumpets as if John knew Ellen White and knew the Adventist Bible Commentary series. And people will go back and forth between Ellen White, the Bible, Adventist commentaries, Adventist doctrine, and suddenly Revelation will be saying things John could never possibly have meant by those texts. Have you heard the one where the locusts that have golden crowns represent Marine helicopters? In other words, American military helicopters that have gold-tinted windshields. That is a very creative kind of, it's a creative kind of a response, but it has nothing to do with what John was writing to the original audience. God meets people where they are. If God wanted to give that prophecy directly to us, he could have done so. He chose to give Revelation in 95 AD, and we need to understand it with that time and place in mind. All right, let's go to the text now. Maybe I should stop just for a moment, Nemanja. Do you know if anyone has a question at this point before we get into the main text?
Okay, jel ima neko pitanje za profesora, pa možemo časkom. We have 10 minutes, so...
I'm ready to continue, but if anyone had a question on method, this would be the best time to ask it.
They say to continue, so...
Okay, then we will continue. All right. And when we get cut off, I guess, we simply go back to the next link and rejoin in a couple of minutes. All right, well, let's move ahead while we have time. And if they give me, I see the countdown, so I'll draw it to a close before we get surprised. All right, so the word trumpet in the Old Testament, there's 6 Hebrew words that could be translated trumpet, and 2 Greek words. You see, we have not only the Hebrew Bible, but we also have the Greek Old Testament, the translation of the Hebrew into Greek anciently, before the time of Jesus. So in looking at these texts, there are 6 Hebrew words and 2 Greek words that represent trumpets or blowing of trumpets. In the Greek, that's what the LXX means. That's the Greek translation, Septuagint it's called. There's 134 Greek words for trumpet in the Old Testament. So if John was writing Revelation with the Septuagint in mind, with that Greek Old Testament in mind, he would be familiar with these Greek words in the Old Testament and how they were used there. And in my study, I found that 53 times trumpets are applied to worship. And this may be a surprise to many, because we think of trumpets as being part of war, that they make signals on the battlefield. But in actual fact, the largest number are in worship. War and battle, 33 times. So you have trumpets can represent worship, or they can represent battle. They're even combined 22 times in the Old Testament. Their trumpets there's a combination of worship and war. In other words, the trumpets are blown by priests, even in battle. They represent prayer. So you could say that between worship and this last category, 75 out of 134 times that the word trumpets appear in the Old Testament is about worship. So worship is a crucial aspect of the background, and it makes us ask the question, what do the trumpets have to do with worship? Because they sure look like battle and chaos and all kinds of things going on. They don't seem very worshipful. But this Old Testament background should give us a question mark. Is it possible that the trumpets mean something very different than what they appear to be on the surface? 10 times, pretty much Ezekiel 33, trumpets are used as warning of an approaching enemy. 9 times, they're used in reference to coronation. And 4 times, theophany. A theophany is where God appears. Like in Exodus 19, when God appeared on Mount Sinai, trumpets were blowing. So trumpets could be used when God appears. They could be used at coronations. They were used for warning, for war signaling, and also they were used in worship. And 3 other usage that are different. All right. Here's the key text in the Old Testament about trumpets. So I want to read that with you carefully. We have 4 minutes, so we have time for this. The sons of Aaron, the priests, are to blow the trumpets. This is to be a lasting ordinance for you and the generations to come. When you go into battle in your own land against an enemy who is oppressing you, sound a blast on the trumpets. Then you will be remembered by the Lord your God and rescued from your enemies. Also at your times of rejoicing, your appointed feasts and new moon festivals, you are to sound the trumpets over your burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, and they will be a memorial for you before your God. I am the Lord your God. Now notice here, When were they to use the trumpets? When they went into battle. They were to blow the trumpets, and what would happen? They would be remembered by God and rescued from their enemies. So even in battle, the blowing of the trumpets was like a prayer, calling on God to rescue them in battle. And then when they were in the temple and they were in the feast days, the blowing of the trumpets was so God would remember them and provide for them forgiveness, provide for them salvation, and so forth. So in the Old Testament, even in battle, you combine the battle texts and the worship texts, and the vast majority of references to trumpets are in the context of covenant prayer. People praying to God for deliverance in battle, praying to God from deliverance in sin. So when we come to the 7 trumpets of Revelation, we need to understand that worship and prayer may well be the crucial background, the very thing maybe we would least expect. So right there, knowing the Old Testament, the trumpets are already beginning to look different than they were before. And I suspect your mind is saying right now, what is there in Revelation 9 that has anything to do with prayer? Good question. But you can't ask that question if you don't know the evidence. And we have just covered the Old Testament evidence. In the context of Revelation, you have the 5th seal, where it says, he opened the 5th seal. I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slaughtered on account of the word of God and on account of the testimony which they maintained. They cried out with a loud voice, saying, how long, O Lord, the Holy and True One, do you not judge and avenge our blood on those who live on the earth? So here you have souls under the altar crying out to God, praying to God for vengeance on their enemies, those who live on the earth. And when you get to the middle of the trumpets, the introductory verse to 5th and 6th trumpets, I saw and heard a vulture flying in mid-heaven, saying with a loud voice, woe to those who live on the earth, because of the rest of the sounds of the trumpets, who are the angels who are about to blow their trumpets. And so you see that the trumpets are a response to the prayers of the saints under the altar. So the whole thing is coming together. When you develop all the evidence, everything comes together, and you begin to get some glimpse of what the trumpets are all about. I think our time is about up. Those of you who have just come in, we will be bumped off here shortly, and then we go back in the second link. We rejoin each other. All right, reminding us. There we go. All right, so we are ready to go again, and let me share the screen once again. So this is where we left off. Okay, so you remember that in the 5th seal, the souls under the altar cry out, how long, Lord, until you judge and avenge our blood on those who live on the earth? This is the cry of the persecuted saints through the ages. And we understand their cry because it's a cry that many people have toward God. Why are we suffering? Why is this happening when we have done that which is right, when we've stayed close to you? Why are we suffering? And the answer comes in the trumpets, that God is intervening within history, even though we may not see it, even though we may not recognize it. God is, in fact, intervening in the course of history. And so the trumpets are a response to the prayers of God's people for deliverance. So within the trumpets themselves, you see God's action in behalf of his people. And so in Revelation 8:3-4 is the introduction to the seven trumpets. And it says, another angel came and stood upon the altar, having a golden censer, and much incense was given to him, in order that he might add it to the prayers of all the saints upon the golden altar before the throne. And the smoke of the altar went up, along with the prayers of the saints, out of the hand of the angel before God. So the opening of the trumpets involves prayer, the prayers of the saints. It is the prayers of the saints that trigger the casting down of the censer and that trigger the blowing of the seven trumpets. So the central theme within the trumpets itself are the prayers of the saints, calling upon God to intervene in this world's history. As you know, according to Seventh-day Adventist understanding, we are living in part of a great cosmic conflict, that the universe is broken, that there is a cosmic battle between God and Satan, between Christ and Satan. And the prayers of the saints play an important part in that battle. Through the prayers of the saints, God is able to intervene in ways that maybe otherwise he could not. So when we begin to see the trumpets in the light of the cosmic conflict as activities in the battle between God and Satan, they have much more meaning than they would have had simply as descriptions of battles, descriptions of isolated historical events. So the seven trumpets point back to the Old Testament concept that trumpets have to do with worship, have to do with God's people and their prayers. So the trumpets are a response to the prayers of the saints within history. So the trumpets are encouraging, because one of the great questions of our time, if God is good and God is powerful, why is there so much pain and suffering and evil in the world? The trumpets were designed to encourage the first readers that they were not forgotten. As they were persecuted by Rome, as they were persecuted by their neighbors, they may have wondered whether they made the right decision in following Jesus Christ. And the book of Revelation is written to encourage them that even though John, their leader, is in exile, is being punished and persecuted, nevertheless, God assures them through him that God is aware of their suffering, that God is dealing with it, that God is still in control of events. Another background to the fifth and sixth trumpet that's important is to understand that the trumpets are judgments on the wicked or the unrighteous. The trumpets themselves are not primarily about the people of God. That's why you see very little reference to God's people in the trumpets. The one place is in the fifth trumpet, as we will see. But the purpose of the trumpets is to describe the consequences of the great controversy, the consequences of Satan's activity, the consequences of those who do not follow God. This is explicitly stated in Revelation 9:4. It was told to them they should not hurt the grass of the earth, or any green thing, or any tree, only those men who did not have the seal of God on their foreheads. So the trumpets are not falling on the faithful people of God. In the seals, you see the faithful people of God suffering. But in the trumpets, the description is for those who are the unsaved, those who are unrighteous, those who are opposing God, that are in view. So that's another important piece for understanding the trumpets as a whole. Verses 20 and 21. The rest of the human race, those who were not killed by these plagues, did not repent of the works of their hands, in order that they might not worship demons or idols of gold, silver, brass, stone, or wood. Such idols are not able to see, hear, or walk. And the rest of the human race did not repent of their murders, magic arts, acts of fornication, or their thefts. So the target, if you will, of the trumpets are those who are not on God's side, those who are opposed to God. And a question one could raise as you read Revelation 9, are these judgments punishments from God? Or are these judgments the consequences of following Satan? That's a question we want to keep in the back of our minds. Is God the destroyer in the seven trumpets? Or is it Satan? The trumpets are giving us a view behind the curtain of the cosmic conflict. And often when we think of the judgments of God, we think of God as a punishing figure who is trying to hurt people. And that may not be the best picture of God that one could give. So the question is, if in these trumpets we're seeing the activities of Satan and blaming God for them, that's exactly what secular people in the world tend to do today. They see suffering brought on by their own actions or by Satan's activity, and they blame God for this. Okay, so you see the movement there?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, this is the one you have been seeing.
Yes.
Now you're seeing this. This is Revelation 9:4. Okay, good. All right, so this is what we've been discussing, that the trumpets are judgments on the wicked. All right. They're also parallel with the bowls. Here is my visual structure of the book of Revelation. You have a prologue, you have an epilogue, and there's strong parallels between them. The seven churches are parallel to the New Jerusalem. The seven seals. Okay, so what you discover is the parallels between the beginning and the end and so on, like a pyramid or a stair step. The trumpets are parallel to the seven bowls. And the seven bowls, the bowl plagues, the seven last plagues, are clearly on the wicked. They are not on the righteous. And so the seven trumpets also must be on the wicked rather than the righteous. Notice the parallel. The first trumpet falls on the earth, so does the first bowl. Second trumpet falls on the sea, so does the second bowl. Third trumpet falls on the rivers and springs, so does the third bowl. The fourth on the heavenly bodies. The fifth, plagues of darkness. The sixth, mention the Euphrates River. And the seventh is the final events of Earth's history. So the seven trumpets and the seven bowls are strongly parallel, which suggest judgments on the wicked. There are some differences. The trumpets are judgments within history, whereas the bowls, all of them are judgments at the end. And the trumpets fall on thirds of the earth. The bowls fall on the whole earth. And the bowls make mention of everything we see in chapters 12, 13, and 14. The trumpets do not. So the trumpets are not written, with the final events in mind, but they cover a larger sweep of history. In the Old Testament background, you also have heathen backgrounds. The trumpets recall the plagues that fell on the Egyptians. The trumpets recall judgments on Babylon in the Old Testament. The trumpets recall Jericho, where every day they marched around the city. And then the seventh day, they marched around it 7 times. And then the city fell. So you have recollections of these heathen backgrounds, which also support the idea that the trumpets are primarily focused on the opponents of God and the opponents of God's people. This is in contrast to the seals, where the background relates to Israel and God's judgments upon his people. So the seals refer back to judgments on the people of God. The trumpets, on the whole, refer to the heathen backgrounds, the pagan backgrounds, in which God is judging heathen nations. All right. Thirds of the earth is interesting. The trumpets fall on third parts of the earth. And what is that all about? Well, in Revelation 16, I think we find something helpful. It says, I saw out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, 3 unclean spirits like frogs. And the great city disintegrated into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. Babylon the Great was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of the fury of his wrath. So here we see that Babylon, end-time Babylon, is in 3 parts. So this suggests to me that when the trumpets fall on thirds of the earth, they are reflecting portions of Satan's kingdom. So various parts of Satan's kingdom are coming under judgment during the 7 trumpets. All right, let me summarize now the first 4 trumpets. We're not going to go through them. They could take 15, 20 minutes each, but you are particularly interested in the 5th and 6th, and we will look at them in detail. But first of all, the first 4 trumpets, I understand that the first trumpet concerns the fall of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was the religious opponent of Jesus. It was the Sanhedrin, the national leaders, religious leaders of Israel that put Jesus on the cross. And so the first judgment in the trumpets is the fall of Jerusalem, in my understanding. Second is the fall of Rome. And Rome was the secular political power that put Jesus on the cross. So I would understand the first 2 trumpets are God's judgments on the powers that crucified Jesus and persecuted the early church. In God's view, these were the major events in the early part of Christian history. Then I would understand that the third trumpet represents the rise of a new religious opposition to God, a surprising religious opposition to God coming right within the Christian church. I would understand that the symbolism of the third trumpet represents the rise of the papacy and its dominance in the Middle Ages. The fourth, on the other hand, the imagery there suggests secularism. Instead of defiling the images of God's activity, it blots them out, it eclipses them, it hides them from view. With secularism, God is not working at all. God is not seen at all. With the papacy, God's work is distorted in a way that can damage people. So I would understand the third and the fourth trumpets as the rise of 2 new powers, one religious, one secular, that will be a major threat at the end of time. And the rest of the book of Revelation, I think, in one way or another, deals with those realities. All right, let me stop at this point. We've been doing an introduction in broad to the trumpets as a whole. I've quickly summarized my understanding of what the symbolism, the exegesis of the first four trumpets would lead us to. Before we get into the fifth trumpet, perhaps there is a question or a comment that someone would like to make.
Can I ask a question about Jericho? You mentioned, so someone say seven trumpets was 7 days before fall of Jericho. Yeah. So they seem like in future to us. So can you answer that?
Yeah. Well, you have a background image. All right. If as John is writing the trumpets, a strong background image would be Jericho, because in the book of Revelation, you see the different Jewish feast days represented as you work your way through. And the one that the trumpets represent is the Feast of Trumpets. And the Feast of Trumpets occurred on the first day of the 7th month, where there'd be a blowing of trumpets, a special blowing of trumpets once a year on the first day of the 7th month. But every first day of the month was a special feast day. It was a so-called new moon day. And so you had a blowing of trumpets on the first day of every month. So on the first month of the year, you'd have the first day, you'd have the new moon festival, blowing of trumpets. Second, first month, blowing of trumpets. Third, fourth, fifth, sixth. But on the 7th day would be the Feast of Trumpets, which would be far, far greater than all the other new moon festivals. So within the Feast of Trumpets is the idea of 6 successive new moon festivals followed by a concluding and climactic Feast of Trumpets in the 7th. To me, this does not mean it's in the future. It simply means that the principle of successive events with a climax is followed in the 7 trumpets. In the 7th trumpet, you have the wrath of God expressed in language that is followed up in chapter 16 with the last plagues. So the 7 last plagues are the 7th trumpet. So the trumpets leading up to it go through history, but then the 7th trumpet includes within it all the final events that follow in chapters 12 and on. So I would not see trumpets 1 through 6 as specifically end time, but rather a broader look at Christian history as a whole. Did you want to follow up on that, Nemanja?
I agree.
Okay.
Can I ask one more question? We see third trumpet like third seal or third church, Pergam. So it seems like similar. Third, fourth century. How you see papacy in third trumpet, and not fall of.
Well, the big challenge with that perspective is the text itself. I think Adventists have assumed that these series, the 7-part series, are all parallel to each other, talking about the same thing. It would be helpful, if that were the case, it would be helpful that the text itself led one to that conclusion. But I have not seen significant parallels between the third church, the third seal, the third trumpet. It seems to me that each of those is saying different things. And the reason I come to the papacy idea is the imagery of the third trumpet. You have the falling star, like a lamp. That star, falling star, reminds us of Isaiah 14, Satan. The burning lamp reminds us of the God's word, the light of his word. The water, representing the water of life. The water is defiled. So you have imagery there of positive spiritual things, the lamp, the water, etc., being defiled in a way that causes harm. People die when they drink of the water. If you understand the trumpets in a more spiritual sense, of prayer and worship, etc., the trumpets would be representing a time in history when the articles of Christianity, the worship of Christianity, the doctrine of Christianity is being distorted. And so I would see the third trumpet as representing the rise of the papacy after the fall of the Roman Empire. So historically, you're kind of in the same place, but it's referencing something different. It's still wicked here. It's still unrighteous, but it's unrighteous with a Christian face. And this is a surprise, but it shouldn't be a surprise if it was religious leaders that put Jesus on the cross. We should not be surprised if it's Christians that put other Christians, so to speak, on the cross or burn them at the stake, etc. I'm not in a position to go through that in detail here, but you have that in the document that I sent. You can look at the evidence there. But I don't see parallels between, you have parallels between the third trumpet and the third bowl. I don't see parallels between the third trumpet, the third seal, and the third church. If I'm wrong on that, I'm open to correction. But in my study of the Greek text, I don't see that as being the intent of the text. As Adventists, we may make those connections. They may be helpful in evangelism or whatever for various reasons. But if we're talking exegesis, what the text was intended to say, it does not seem to be pointing to that parallel. All right. Trumpet, go ahead.
May I ask a question before we continue?
Sure.
So basically, the fourth trumpet is the rise of secularism. And we already mentioned that trumpets are actually punishments for the unbelievers, for bad people, actually. But how can rise of secularism punish the people who are, already secular, although it was not an established movement in such time? If you can understand me.
Sure. And I was planning to talk about that a little bit more later, but maybe this is a good time to say in brief. Again, it comes back to the question, by judgments of God, do we mean punishments of God? I don't think those two words have to mean the same thing. See, we naturally go there. But in the Bible, most judgments of God are not direct actions, but they are rather God withdrawing his protection from people who have rejected him. And the consequences of God withdrawing his protection is they come under Satan's control, and Satan is the destroyer. And so when God's people come away from the true faith, when the gospel gets distorted, there is great damage that results. And you see that in the third trumpet. The people who drink the water, thinking to find life, die. So the means of bringing life are causing great harm, spiritual harm, and also physical harm. So the rise of the papacy is God allowing those who have distorted the faith to reap the consequences of that distortion, which means absence of the gospel and often further consequences as well. What are the consequences of secularism? We will see that very clearly in the fifth trumpet. It is suicidal anguish. When people have no life, no meaning, when they no longer believe in a God, life becomes very difficult to bear. My son is online lots of times with with the young people around the world that like to play the same computer games, most of them seem to be atheists today. And he's constantly frustrated by the conversations he has with them. But clearly, atheism is not leading these kids to a better way of life. They're confused, they're desperate, they go on drugs, alcohol, they do terrible things that you know will lead them to a dark future. But they have no ethical grounding. They have no future. So secularism is its own punishment. God doesn't have to add to that punishment. And what we will see in the fifth and sixth trumpets is how bad it gets for those who embrace either secularism or the false religion. All right, so let's get into the fifth and sixth trumpets. We can get started. We have 10 minutes before we have to take a required Zoom break, it appears. All right, so in the fifth trumpet, one thing you always begin asking when you're looking at the text is, what's the Old Testament background? Are there any places in the Old Testament or the New Testament that are clearly parallel to this text that can give us some insight into what the text is talking about? One possibility is Joel 2, verses 1 to 11, where you have parallel after parallel between the fifth trumpet and Joel 2, some 8 or 9 major words in common. Joel 2 is God's judgment on unfaithful people. But thinking about what we talked about just a moment ago, if the judgment on God's people in Joel is the Babylonian invasion, is that a punishment of God? Or is God allowing Nebuchadnezzar to do what he wants to do? And God's people who don't want him, allowing them to have their freedom from God, which turns out to be very, very destructive for them. So when it talks about God's judgment, it doesn't always mean God directly intervening to spank them like a child. But sometimes there's God saying, I think of Pharaoh. This is funny, I think. Pharaoh says to God, Moses says to Pharaoh, let my people go. And Pharaoh says to Moses, they'll go only over my dead body. And God says back to Pharaoh, have it your way. We'll do it your way. You see, Pharaoh's resistance to God ends up being his own undoing. And so often the judgments of God are like that. I think the plagues of Egypt are largely interventions of God in one form or another, but God's judgments are not always direct interventions. In fact, most of the time, it is God allowing Satan to do what he wants to do, which is destructive. Another parallel to the fifth trumpet is the plagues of the locusts and the plagues of darkness in Exodus chapter 10. And there you have interventions of God. With Joel, it's a little more murky. But there's another text, I think, that is much more helpful to us in understanding the fifth trumpet. And that is Luke 10, verses 17 to 20. And in Luke 10, 17 to 20, you have 8 major Greek words in common. Let's notice the text. The 72 returned with joy, saying, Lord, even the demons are subject to us in your name. And he said to them, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. Behold, I have given you authority to tread on serpents and scorpions, and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing will hurt you. Nevertheless, do not rejoice in this, that the spirits are subject to you, but rejoice that your names are written in heaven. So here Jesus is talking to his disciples. His disciples just returned from a missionary journey where they found that by praying in the name of Jesus, demons would come out of people, something that they thought was impossible for a human being to do. And they're all excited about this. And Jesus then responds by saying, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. That's an allusion to Satan's original fall. But Jesus applies it to what the disciples were doing. When you drive demons out of these individuals, Satan's fall is occurring. I have given you authority to tread on serpents and scorpions and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall hurt you. So Jesus is saying that at times when the demons are operating on this earth, at times like that, they will hurt only the unsaved. God will not permit the demons to take hold of one of his people. That, it seems to me, along with trumpets as worship, is an important background to the fifth trumpet. Whatever's going on in the fifth trumpet, it has to do with demons, and it has to do with God's protection of his people. If we haven't read the fifth trumpet in that way, we're probably not understanding it correctly. So here you see these words: demons, Satan, the enemy, the spirits, serpents and scorpions. Very clearly demonic language in Luke 10, and demonic language in the fifth trumpet. So in whatever we do with the fifth trumpet, we need to keep that in our minds as we move forward. Demonic imagery. But God maintains ultimate control even of the demons. It says that the star fell from heaven. It says that authority was given to the destroyer to do what he does. God is in ultimate control. But in the fifth trumpet, we see him allowing Satan to be very destructive in this world, but shielding his own people from that demonic attack. All right, so verse 1, the fifth angel blew his trumpet, and I saw a star having fallen out of heaven to earth, and the key to the pit of the abyss was given to him. So here you have the fifth angel blowing his trumpet, and a star doesn't fall from heaven. It says the star having fallen out of heaven to earth, and the key to the pit of the abyss was given to him. This having fallen reference means it's the same star as the third trumpet. And if the third trumpet is what I've been saying it is, if the third trumpet is about the rise of the papacy, then that has something to do with the secularization we will see in the fifth trumpet. And if you read Great Controversy, you see that the French Revolution, which was the rise of secularism in this world, where it became plain to everyone's eyes, was as a result of what happened to France during the Middle Ages, that the church had lost all of its luster in France because of its persecutions, because of its false doctrines, etc. And that this played a direct role in the rise of secularism, that people lost a taste for the Bible, lost a taste for things of God, etc. And they threw off all religion. They went to the opposite extreme. And it says the key to the pit of the abyss was given to him. So you have reference to the third trumpet, the star that had fallen. Luke 8:31, the abyss is the place where demons are confined. So here we see the demonic language very clearly. The abyss is the place where demons are confined. God is allowing, provides the key to the fallen star to open the abyss, and the demons come out of the abyss. The abyss is also the source of the beast in chapters 11 and chapter 17. So the fifth trumpet, whatever you make of it, there's a demonic element here, an element of God's permission, and an element of God's protection of his people. All of these are playing together in the fifth trumpet. And we will continue our study because all right. So this is where we were. Reference to the third trumpet, the abyss where demons are, the source of the beast, etc. Verse 2, he opened the pit of the abyss, and smoke came up out of the pit like the smoke of a great furnace. The sun and the air were darkened by the smoke from the abyss. In the New Testament and in the Bible generally, the sun represents the Bible and represents Jesus. Light represents the gospel and represents Jesus. So when you look at the imagery, remember what I mentioned about movies of the future? That one of the dangers is that Adventists sometimes come to a text like the trumpets and say, well, John is just seeing a movie of the future, and so I just need to find literally where these things occur. But when you look at the language in the context of the first century, when the revelation was given, the language is full of spiritual implications. So what is happening is it's a darkening of the Bible. It's a darkening of the gospel. It's a blotting out of Jesus from the minds of people, whatever is going on in here. So the partial darkness of the fourth trumpet becomes total darkness here. The fifth trumpet is an intensification, I believe, of the secularism that began in the time of the fourth trumpet. So you see secularism coming to dominate the world with some serious consequences. The locusts came out of the smoke onto the earth, and they were given authority like the scorpions of the earth have authority.
Professor, can you reopen presentations, please?
We're having that problem again. Okay.
Yeah.
Let me redo it. Zoom does have its quirks, but we're grateful that we have that as an option. All right. Can you see that? Let me see if I can go back one slide. There we go. All right. So this is where we started. So the sun represents the Bible and Jesus, etc. The darkening is the opposition to the Bible, to the gospel. Locusts came out of the smoke unto the earth. They were given authority like the scorpions of the earth have authority. And they were told that they should not hurt the grass of the earth or any green thing or any tree. Only those men who did not have the seal of God on their foreheads. And so you see that the trumpets are falling on the wicked, as we have seen. The people of God will not be hurt by them. Now, when you talk about the seal of God, sometimes Adventists assume this must be end time, because the seal of God is an end time concept. That's true in Revelation 7. But much more broadly in the New Testament, the seal of God is a spiritual concept that was a living reality at the time of Jesus. 2 Timothy 2 says, the seal of God is this: God knows them that are his. The sealed are people that belong to God. God knows them. We might not know. We don't know who on this Zoom call is sealed and who is not, but God does. You see? So the sealing is a mark that only God knows. And 2 Corinthians 1:22 says similarly, as do other texts in the New Testament. In other words, the sealed are those who are genuinely right with God. They're not Seventh-day Adventists. They're not Roman Catholics. They're not any particular religion necessarily. They are people that God knows belong to him, whatever label they may wear. Now, those who have sought to see these locusts as Muslim armies, were the Muslim armies able to distinguish between true followers of Jesus and counterfeit ones? That piece of the history just doesn't fit. So here you have a plague that only God could control. where God says, Satan, you're free to do whatever you want, except, like with Job, you can't kill him. Or in the beginning of Job, you can't harm him. Satan is given limits by God. Within those limits, he can destroy. But God knows those who belong to him. And God says, those that belong to me, you cannot touch, and I will not allow it. So this plague, whatever it is a plague that hurts only those who are opposed to God and his people. Whatever this is, it's not harming God's people. Obviously, in the Middle Ages, God's people were harmed all the time. At the end of time, God's people will be harmed. But this particular plague cannot harm God's people. And that has to be taken into account when you assess the meaning of the fifth trumpet. Here's the consequences of the fifth trumpet. It was given to them, the locust scorpions, that they should not kill the unsealed, but rather they should be tormented for 5 months. And their torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it stings a man. In those days, men will seek death, but they will not find it. They will long to die, yet death will flee away from them. The consequence of this plague is not physical. It's suicidal anguish. It's mental torment. The language may be military, but the outcome is a spiritual one. It is a psychological one. And in my mind, this fits best secularism, where one of the results of secularism is suicidal anguish. During this time of COVID, the young people, particularly around the world, are having a major issue with suicide, because if you take away the gospel, take away the scriptures, take away the meaning of life, often suicide seems like the most attractive future. Verse 10, these locusts had tails like scorpions and stingers, and with their tails they had authority to harm the human race for 5 months. This concept of the tail has an interesting application in Isaiah 9:15. The elder and the honored man is the head. The prophet who teaches lies is the tail. The tool of the fifth trumpet, the punishing tool, is teaching. It's ideas. This is an ideological plague. This is a psychological plague, a mental plague, rather than a military one, when you look carefully at the imagery. The power of secularism to hurt is in the idea itself. False doctrine produces the plague. And then finally, it identifies the boss. They had a king over them, the angel of the abyss. His name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek, his name is Apollyon. This is what's called in linguistics a hendiadys. In other words, it's taking words in different languages that mean the same thing. Abaddon in Hebrew means the destroyer. And in Greek, Apollyon means the one who destroys. Satan, the angel of the abyss, the head of the demons, is named the destroyer. It is not God who is the destroyer of the fifth trumpet, even though it's a judgment of God. God is not the one who destroys. It is Satan who destroys. Reminds me of John 10:10, where Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. The thief, he has come to steal and to destroy. But I am the good shepherd. I care for my sheep. You see, God is not the destroyer. And often in the secular world, God is blamed for everything that goes wrong in the world. But Revelation is making it clear Satan is the destroyer, and that it is Satan's activity that we are blaming God for. So the angel of the abyss is Satan, the one who destroys. So a quick summary of the fifth trumpet, and I'll keep moving because we want to get the sixth trumpet done as well before I have to let you go. The fifth trumpet is a judgment of God. It's allowed by God, God's ultimate control. There's demonic imagery. It's related to the third and fourth trumpets, the darkness and the falling star. The abyss is a place of demonic confinement. So the fifth trumpet is a time when the demons are released to do what they do in this earth. It'll be a time of great demonic activity. Light and darkness are related to the gospel and to God. But the plague, whatever it is, doesn't harm the sealed. It induces a mental torment in those who are affected by it. A plague, a false teaching which bears its own consequences. So I think you can see the evidence of the text. Is this an Islamic judgment? I find it difficult to fit all of these characteristics into the traditional approach to these texts. It is not an Islamic plague, it is a satanic plague that is in view. It seems to me secularism best fits everything, all the evidence that we find in this text. So, what do we know about secularism historically? First of all, it's a curse to institutional religion. That seems like a bad thing. But institutional religion is often the problem. There's something about when we institutionalize religion, we do it for a good purpose. We create a religion in order to honor God, in order to honor something God did in our world. But over time, institutions of religion become more concerned with their own survival than with the original mission. And institutional religion can become the problem. Secularism in that sense is actually a blessing to true believers, because true believers are not harmed by secularism. I remember the sticker on the back of a car one day that said, "God is not dead. I talked to him last night." In other words, if you know the living God, secularism is not going to harm you. It cannot harm you. It's actually a blessing to true believers because God's living presence is not threatened. And secularism has brought religious liberty into the world generally. One exception would be, of course, the Soviet Union and some of its consequences in recent history. But generally, secularism goes hand in hand with religious liberty. And that is a blessing to true believers. Secularism's the outcome of rejecting the true gospel. And the fifth trumpet portrays the despair of godless philosophy. Possibly a connection here with Daniel 11, but let's not get into that. Our time is short, and I don't think that is critical to interpretation. So secularism can result in spiritual longing that is often fulfilled by demons. Many people don't realize that the Soviet Union was the world leader in parapsychology, in the scientific study of things that cannot be explained. Because secularist atheists are really prepared in many ways spiritually. It produces a spiritual longing that the demons are happy to fulfill. So demonology and secularism are not far apart, even though they seem to be opposites at times. Demons fulfill the longings that secularism produces, and that's what we will see in the sixth trumpet. The sixth trumpet is the reaction to the secularism of the fifth. A question Adventists must ask, of course, is what about Ellen White and the Great Controversy, 334 to 335? She doesn't quote Revelation 9. She doesn't exegete Revelation 9, but she mentions it in passing. Josiah Litch, one of the leading ministers preaching the Second Advent, published an exposition of Revelation 9, predicting the fall of the Ottoman Empire in the year 1840. According to his calculations, you notice Ellen White is not offering her own opinion necessarily. She's telling the story of the early Advent movement. And part of that story is the way Josiah Litch exegeted Revelation 9. According to his calculations, this power was to be overthrown in 1840, sometime in the month of August. And only a few days previous to its accomplishment, he wrote, allowing the first period, 150 years, to have been exactly fulfilled before Deacozes ascended the throne by permission of the Turks, and at the 391 years, 15 days commenced at the close of the first period, it will end on the 11th of August, 1840, when the Ottoman power in Constantinople may be expected to be broken. And this, I believe, will be found to be the case. And then she goes on to say, at the very time specified, you notice that she doesn't say fulfillment of prophecy. She doesn't say fulfillment of the fifth trumpet or the sixth trumpet. She says, at the time specified by Litch, Turkey, through her ambassadors, accepted the protection of the Allied powers of Europe and thus placed herself under the control of Christian nations. The event exactly fulfilled the prediction. Notice she doesn't say the Bible prediction, but the prediction of Litch. When it became known, multitudes were convinced of the correctness of the principles of prophetic interpretation adopted by Miller and his associates, and a wonderful impetus was given to the Advent movement. So in Great Controversy, Ellen White is not exegeting the text, but she's telling a historical story that's part of the larger story she's telling in Great Controversy. She does not exegete the text. She doesn't even quote the text. So let's look at that. Is she quoting Revelation 9? Yes, she cites Revelation 9, but doesn't quote the text. Is it an exegetical use or a homiletical use? Clearly homiletical, because she's telling a story of which this is a small piece. And Litch's use of Revelation 9 leads him to the things that he says, but she herself is not exegeting the text. It's in a published work, so we need to take it seriously as she's writing what she intends to write. Is Revelation 9 the central point of the text? No, it's not. So it's neither exegetical, nor is Revelation 9 that important to the text. What's important is the prediction that was made, the events that followed, and the impact those events had on people's minds. It came sort of in the middle of her career, so it's neither earlier nor later. Is it an isolated or frequent reference? It's the only reference in all of her writings to Revelation 9. So the sum total of what Ellen White has to say about Revelation 9, if she said anything, is right here in the text. And it's clearly not an attempt to exegete the text as such. So I would suggest it is probably not appropriate for us to take that offhand comment about Revelation 9 and make it the primary driver of how we read Revelation 9. She herself would say, don't quote my writings until you know what the Bible says. And that's what we're working on together today. So, sixth trumpet, we have maybe 15 minutes. So I will need to move quickly, but you have materials that I shared with Nemanja that you can follow up and go in more detail. All right, parallels within Revelation to the sixth trumpet. First of all is Revelation 7. I saw 4 angels. You have 4 angels in Revelation 7, and you have I heard the number in Revelation 7. In the sixth trumpet, release the 4 angels bound by the river Euphrates. The number of mounted soldiers is 200 million. I heard the number of them. So the 144,000 and the 200 million are parallel concepts. They're both military. The 144,000 is military language. Don't have time to show that today. But you just need to trust me on that. The 144,000 is a military concept. So are the 200 million. The sixth trumpet shows the rise of Satan's forces at the end of time, just as the 144,000 is God's people at the end of time. The two are counterparts to each other. That's important for understanding the sixth trumpet. However we choose to interpret it, it depicts the rise of Satan's people at the end of time who will oppose God and oppose people in the final crisis. So it's Satan's counterpart of the 144,000 are being judged in the sixth trumpet. They're also rising up. Revelation 16, you remember I mentioned a Catholic scholar that pointed something out to me that I hadn't seen? Here it is, all right? I had not seen the strength of the parallel between the sixth trumpet and the sixth bowl. The sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, for they are the spirits of demons doing signs which go out to the kings of the world to gather them for the battle of the great day of God Almighty. Sixth trumpet has great river Euphrates, demonic language, military language. That combination occurs in only two places in Revelation or in the entire Bible. That combination right here in Revelation 16 and in the sixth trumpet. So the sixth trumpet is parallel in some ways to the final battle of Earth's history. I would see the sixth trumpet as Satan gathering his forces for Armageddon, as we see here. They go out to the kings of the world to gather them for the battle. That is what I understand is happening in the sixth trumpet. It happens before the close of probation, because in the sixth plague, this is not the time of the plague, it's the run-up to the plague. The drying up of the river Euphrates is the last thing that happens. And then John gives the preparation for those events. So Euphrates, military, demonic language, sixth trumpet, sixth bowl are parallel. So what the sixth trumpet is all about is Satan gathering his forces for the battle of Armageddon. So verse by verse, the first woe has gone away. Two more woes are coming after this. There's a sense of progression. First, you have the dominance of secularism. Then you have the rise of end-time Babylon. And then you have the final plagues. So the woes of verse 12 here are trumpets 5, 6, and 7. And remember that 10 to 11 is part of the sixth trumpet. In 10 and 11, you have the final proclamation of the gospel to the world, leading up to the close of probation. So the gospel is going to the world in chapters 10 and 11. A satanic gospel is going to the world in the sixth trumpet. It's the rise of end-time Babylon, the rise of religious opposition to the remnant, to the 144,000 in the final crisis. So chapters 10 and 11 are leading up to the time of the end. Verse 13, the sixth angel sounded his trumpet, and I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar, which is before God. That recalls the prayers of the saints in the beginning. Those prayers are still going up. The sixth trumpet is still God's response to the prayers of the saints, working in history to bring about the resolution of what they're praying about. Intercession is still in view. Probation is not closed in the sixth trumpet, but I would suggest it leads up to the close of probation for reasons we may not have time to share this morning. Saying to the sixth angel at the trumpet, release the four angels who are bound by the great river Euphrates. The river Euphrates in the Old Testament was the border of the promised land. And so beyond the Euphrates was the extremities of the earth in the Israelite view. So here you have the four angels who are bound by the river Euphrates. It's like releasing a flood that will end up attacking the people of God. Reminds us perhaps of the four corners of the earth in chapter 7, that these angels, when they release the winds, then all hell breaks loose on earth, but does not harm the sealed. So again, there's a parallel between chapter 7 and chapter 16. The four angels by the great river Euphrates who are prepared for that very hour, day, month, and year. Oh boy, I just lost my screen again. I don't know how this is happening. Let me... Okay, it's not... I'm going to have to stop share and come back in. Sorry about that. There are always exciting things with Zoom. Here we are again. Can you all see that?
Yes, we see.
Okay, we'll continue. So they're prepared for that very hour, day, month, and year. And here you see the Greek. It has the article with 4 references to time. This is a very common Greek expression. It means that all 4 of these things are the same. They're all, you don't add these up like some commentators have said, but it's that very hour, day, month, and year. It's a point in time. Let me illustrate it this way. If I were to ask you how long you were married, you would start with the number of years, wouldn't you? Your years, months, days, hours. If I were to ask you when you were married, you would start with the time. It was 2 in the afternoon on the 23rd of December in 19 whatever. It's when we got married. So this particular expression is a point in time rather than a period of time, as some have suggested. I would suggest it's the point in time of chapter 10. The point when the 6th trumpet begins, the point when Daniel's time prophecies end. In other words, the 6th trumpet is the time of the end. It's the time when Satan is gathering his forces and God's gospel is going out to the world. The final gospel is going out to the world. It's the time of the end. As we mentioned, the 200 million and the number, Satan's host is being numbered at the time of judgment, just as God's people are being numbered. It's the counterpart of the 144,000. It's also parallels to the 2 witnesses of Revelation 11. And in Revelation 10, John is told, you will prophesy again. And then you see the work of the 2 witnesses leading up to the end of time in Revelation 11. So there's strong parallels between the 6th trumpet and the work of the gospel and the people who do that work. Revelation 9:19, for the authority of the horses was in their mouths and in their tails. For their tails were like snakes having heads, and with them they did harm. Remember that the secular forces, we have 10 minutes to go here, and I think we will make it easily. The authority of the horses in their mouths and in their tails. The tails, remember, that was the penalty of the 5th trumpet. The secular forces used their tails. This particular group uses their mouths and the tails. So the secular forces are not gone. They're co-opted. It's like the woman riding on the beast. The woman represents religious Babylon. The beast represents political, secular authority in Revelation 17. So the secular forces don't disappear at the end of time. They're co-opted by the religious powers that control them for a short time. And then Revelation 9:20 to 21 says the rest of the human race who are not killed by these plagues did not repent of the works of their hands, that they might not worship demons or idols of gold, silver, brass, stone, and wood. Such idols are not able to see, hear, and walk. The rest of the human race did not repent of their murders, magic arts, acts of fornication, or their theft. So you see the demonic element is still here, along with the Babylonian element, where you have Daniel 5:23, you have this language about idols of silver, brass, stone, and wood. You have references to the magic arts of Babylon. So these verses here point us to Babylon as the background. The fifth trumpet has no references to Babylon. It is more talking about Egypt and the more secular approach. But the sixth trumpet is the rise of end-time Babylon and its final threat to the people of God. In other words, in the final crisis, evil will have a Christian face. That's the big surprise of the book of Revelation, that the followers of Jesus, or those who claim to be followers of Jesus, may prove to be the biggest challenge at the end of time. Conclusion of the sixth trumpet. The end-time Babylon is a blend of two things. A blend of Christian Rome with its error and oppression, with secularism, with its skepticism, ecumenism, evolution, etc. And we see today very much the strength of secularism, but also the rise of a spirituality, a postmodern spirituality, that in many ways has some of the greatest problems of Rome, but combining it with more secular perspectives. What are God's people doing during the time of the sixth trumpet? They're sending the gospel to the world, and they are suffering the opposition of the enemy powers. As I close, let me just reflect for a moment on the problems with the traditional view of Josiah Litch and Uriah Smith. First of all, Uriah Smith never studied the trumpets. How do I know that? Because the entire part of the trumpets was lifted from an earlier document that Smith did not write. Smith himself did not know what to do with the trumpets. And as a result, he just filled it in. When you write a commentary, you've got to put something there. And he took it 100% out of earlier writings. It may not even have been written. Most of them were not written by Seventh-day Adventists. They were written by people of various backgrounds. Most of what Smith says is in quotation marks. Litch himself, who put together the view that's mentioned in Great Controversy, repudiated it later on. He said that was a mistake. When he writes his own commentary on Revelation, he makes no reference to Turkey or any of the other things that he shared in that way. It contradicts the Greek, as we pointed out. Bill Shea spent significant time during the Daniel and Revelation Committee trying to support Litch's work and was not able to do it. I don't think anyone has tried harder than Shea to do that. So at this point, neither the exegesis nor the history, as you probably know, Turkey, the Ottoman Empire fell in the 1920s, not in 1840. So history doesn't support Litch, and the text does not support, as Litch himself came to understand later on. Arthur White, Ellen White's grandson, said that in Great Controversy, she was not telling us what the Bible means in the fifth and sixth trumpet. She was reporting on history. We should not read Revelation 9 on the basis of Great Controversy. The Great Controversy statement itself is not an exegetical statement. It's not attempting to interpret Revelation 9. Willie White himself said, with Ellen White's signature in a letter in 1912, Ellen White was not an expert in history. That was not her purpose in writing Great Controversy and should not be used to interpret history as such. A Daniel and Revelation committee sought very, very hard to study the trumpets. And while we had a general agreement on what I've shared with you, there were some that did not see it that way. And so we didn't publish for that reason. There was a lack of consensus. The Daniel and Revelation committee only published when everyone was in agreement. So you have the challenge of scripture and tradition. Even Adventists sometimes wrestle with ideas that have come to us, but when the biblical text doesn't seem to support them, that can be hard to let go. What I've shared with you is not the final word. I want to be clear on that. Ellen White says, let us give more time to the study of the Bible. We do not understand the word as we should. She wrote this after Uriah Smith, by the way. When we as a people understand what Revelation means to us, there'll be seen among us a great revival. We do not understand fully the lessons that it teaches, notwithstanding the injunction to search and study it. She recognized, even at the end, that we do not understand Revelation fully as we could. When the books of Daniel and Revelation are better understood, believers will have an entirely different religious experience. If that hasn't happened yet, then you and I have more to learn. Thank you for this opportunity to share with you. I think we have about 2 minutes left, so Nemanja, I'll turn it over to you. And if you have a question or anyone else does, if not, feel free to close the meeting.
Thank you, Professor. I have a question. I agree all. So we have a star falling in third trumpet, which is the rise of papacy. So it's Satan, no doubt. But why don't we interpret also like Satan who controls some religious power, like in Revelation 12? So why don't we do that in Revelation 9?
Well, as I said, I don't think most Adventists have studied the trumpets exegetically, and therefore don't even notice, the images of Satan and things like that. They just see historical events, secular events in this text. So I think that I was perhaps the first to truly attempt to go, line by line, text by text with this. We have about a minute left.
Okay. In last words in the sixth trumpet, we have they are not they are killed. Yeah. But in fifth verse we have death fly away from them. So that's contradiction almost. Can you explain?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, the fifth trumpet is a psychological torment. The sixth seems to be more directly physical. But again, we're dealing with imagery of Babylon, imagery of demons. And as I've been saying, I'm telling you what it seems to me. I don't think this is the final word. There's much more that I have to learn. And maybe that's a good place to stop.
Okay.
It will stop us here in about 20 seconds, regardless. Thank you, everybody, for this opportunity. I wish we could have gone back and forth more. I wish I could have seen your faces, but I'm glad that we could be here together, and may God be with you.
Thank you so much. We are blessed.